So, I'm going to be discussing the Russian military intervention in Ukraine in 2014 and the US invasion of Panama 1989 to 1990. So, I'm going to start with the Russian military intervention in Ukraine. So, first of all, where um, is this going to take place? So, here is Russia, and as we can see, it's highlighted. This is Ukraine, and this is Crimea. And what will be discussed is whether or not Crimea would be a part of when would Crimea be a part of Ukraine, and when would it be a part of Russia or wherever else. So we zoom into Crimea. This is important for a little later. We can see that Crimea is attached to Ukraine, and that it's not physically connected to Russia. So, a historical timeline for Ukraine and also concerning Crimea is that Ukraine was under the Russian Empire's control for nearly 400 years. And Crimea was under the Ottoman Empire's control until 1783 when Russia took control. And in 1853 to 1856, what's known as the Crimean War took place. And it was a war practically Russia versus the Ottoman Empire, France, and Britain. And this war was basically for the right side, these people, to ensure Russia didn't gain any power in the Balkans. And if this is Crimea, this is also the Balkans. Okay, so in 1917, the Russian Revolution took place. And it would form the newly created United Union of Soviet Social Republics, the USSR, in 1922, where Crimea joins the USSR. So in 1954, the Russian SSR gave Crimea to the Ukraine SSR. So they did this for a reason, quote, "The cession of Crimea was a noble act on the part of the Russian people to commemorate the 300th anniversary of their unification." So basically, Crimea was given to Ukraine as a gift. But then in 1991, when the USSR fell, all the countries that were previously involved became independent, including Ukraine. And when Ukraine became independent, Crimea became autonomous, meaning it had its own parliament and prime minister, but the foreign policy and international relation would still be in control of Ukraine. So, within this Russian invasion of 2014, who is going to be involved? So we have Viktor Yanukovych, who is the elected 2010 president of Ukraine. We have Vladimir Putin, who is the Russian president. And we have Sergei Aksionov, who will be the Crimean prime minister in 2014. And of course, we have the involvement of the Ukrainians and Crimeans. So what happened? So in 2008, there were three countries who were formerly Soviet Union who had not either joined the EU or NATO. In these countries are Belarus, Ukraine, and Moldova. So in 2008, Ukraine applied for NATO membership. The reason why joining one of these groups would be an advantage to Ukraine is, especially for the EU, it would give them, Ukrainians, the freedom to live, work anywhere in Europe. It's way easier to travel around Europe. Trading partners, that's an advantage to their economy. And this is also a possible protection from threat, as the group could be allies with each other. So, in 2010, the Ukrainian presidential elections there were two main parties, Yulia Tymoshenko and Viktor Yanukovych. So, this map shows pretty much a divide between Ukraine, where the eastern side was pro Tymoshenko, and she supported the idea that Ukraine should gain closer ties and be part of the EU. And then on the oh crap, I meant the western side. That's the western. And then on the eastern side, the people majority of the people wanted to Yanuko- Yanukovych to be president, and he strived for Ukraine to gain closer ties with Russia. So, um, just a little background: Timoshenko was in office before 2010, and she was part of the government when they decided to join the EU in 2008. So what happened was in 2010, Viktor Yanukovych won the presidential elections. And the problems don't begin until 2013. So, keeping in mind right now, in 2013, the Ukrainian economy is not doing so well. So, in 2013, November, Yanukovych was supposed to sign the EU Association Agreement, officially making Ukraine part of the EU. But what Yanukovych did was he suspended the association agreement. So, this didn't rile people up yet, as suspended means a possibility in the future. But then in 2013, Ukraine, or Yanukovych, signs a bailout with Russia. And a bailout is a financial support, which is basically what joining the EU would have done for Ukraine. And this financial support was that Russia will buy $15 billion of Ukrainian Eurobonds, and the cost of Russian natural gas supply to Ukraine will be reduced. So this is all working in favor of the Ukrainian economy. And after he decided to join Ukraine, um, this is when the people started Euromaidan protests. Euromaidan protests demanded closer ties with the EU. And most of this Euro protest happened in the western side of Ukraine. And we can see this map shows like if you look at this map and the presidential election map, you can see that the western side is where less than 25% people speak Russian as their native language, and they are the side that wanted to be closer with the EU. But then on the eastern side, this is where more than 25% of people speak Russian as their native language, and a bit over 10% of people ethnically identified as Russian. So, these Euromaidan protests began in December 2013, and by February 2014, the protests became violent when Yanukovych involved the Ukrainian military. And not so long after, Yanukovych flees to Russia, and an interim government, so a temporary government, is set in place. And to solve this Euromaidan protest, this government um, tells arranges a peace agreement where they pledge that Ukraine will join the EU. So this is when the Russian invasion begins, also known as the Crimean Crisis. So after Yanukovych fled Ukraine, in Crimea, remember how they have an autonomous government? So within their little state, mass pro-Russian protesters situated themselves around the Crimean parliament and demanded a reformation concerning its independence. So they wanted Crimea to either join Russia or be completely independent. So the parliament was kept hostages until the prime minister, Anatoly Mohyliov, was removed. So they replaced that prime minister with a pro-Russian prime minister, Sergei Aksionov. And what he did was, once he was in charge, he asked for Vladimir Putin's assistance in controlling the peace in Crimea, aka helping Crimea become part of Russia. So what Russia did was, in this part right here, how I said they brought mass pro-Russian protesters. So what Russia did was bring in, quote, mass soldiers without any insignia to take over airports, military bases, administrative buildings, and other strategic locations all over Crimea. So insignia meaning they didn't have an identification of being part of a military or an organization. And by placing these soldiers within all these areas, this would disarm the Ukrainian military within Crimea. So I think it's important to define an invasion, and I'm going to use a Wikipedia to do that. So, quote, an invasion is a military offensive in which large parts of combatants of one geopolitical entity aggressively enters territory controlled by another such entity, generally with the objective of either conquering, liberating, or re-establishing control or authority over a territory, forcing the partition of a country, altering the established government, or gaining concessions from said government or a combination thereof. So, like I said, Russia Russia supposedly brought in massed soldiers to take over parliament, and a lot of countries recognize this as Russian military intervention. So once the prime minister was changed and Aksionov was in place, Crimea had an election. I mean, a voting. So this was their reformation. Apparently, they had an 83.1% voting turnout, and 96.77% of those people voted to join a Russian Federation, and 2.51% joined to become independent. Notice how there are no options to join the Ukraine or stay a part of the Ukraine. But the problem with this is that most countries do not recognize this as legitimate, as they did not allow foreign observation on the voting, and because since there's so much military intervention within Crimea at this time, there was a lot of military pressure for the people to vote for the Russian Federation. So while this was happening in Crimea, that was in March. In July, newly elected president of Ukraine, Petro Poroshenko, declared Ukraine to have one official language, removing Russian. And if you remember that map, most of the people in the eastern side, well, more than 25% of people in the eastern side spoke Russia as their first language, but more than 75% of the people were in Crimea and this area right here, Luhansk and Donetsk. So the people of Donetsk and Luhansk were enraged by this and declared that they wanted to be part of Russia instead. So, and today, if we see parts of Russia, Russia has also invaded areas situated across this eastern border. So, why did Russia invade? So, what would Russia gain from having these areas of Ukraine? Well, Ukraine kind of serves as a border between NATO and Russia. So if Russia were to have joined Ukraine, if Ukraine would have had to join NATO, NATO could have placed troops on the border between Russia and Ukraine. And if by Russia gaining this peninsula, the Crimea, this would prevent possible NATO intervention, as they would have a little fair playing field with the ports for their Black Sea Fleet in Crimea. So other people believe that this one I'm not too sure about it, but is that Putin, who is the president of Russia, wanted to obtain former territories of the Soviet Union, a possible opportunity to expand Russia's borders. So that one is not too legitimate of a reason. Maybe it's a small one. And there's also the strategic location of Crimea. So there's access to the Balkans, the Black Sea, and the Mediterranean. And if you know Russia, most of their coasts are along pretty cold waters. So in Crimea, the waters are actually warm, and on all Russia's other coasts, their boats freeze. So having Crimea, this port in Crimea, would be a huge advantage to their navy. Also, Russia is highly dependent on its oil and gas industry, which is being pumped through mainly Ukrainian pipes. So, if the EU were to have, if Ukraine would have joined the EU could have had possible control over these pipes, and they could have put restrictions or conditions on these Russian pipes, and so this would work against the Russian interests. So, explaining what happened in the lenses of analysis, well, the individual or group goals is that Vladimir Putin, the Russian prime minister, was doing it for kind of state, but sub-state reasons as well. So, mainly I'm going to sub-state. So this image right here shows the Russian approval of Putin in on a timeline. So in 2013, right before the Russian invasion, his approval was 54%. But when Putin started to show a little recognition for and interest in gaining Crimea and somewhat uniting the people of who ethnically identify themselves as Russian, his approval rate skyrocketed to 83%. And this was great because people who are actually your people actually have to like you, obviously, in your country, and this is exactly what he was doing. So Crimea wanted was doing this for sub-state reasons, where as well the individuals, because they ethnically identified as Russian, they wanted to be part of Russia again. So, and Ukrainian reasons for joining the EU or Russia, well, gaining closer ties to them, would be for systemic reasons. Like I said, this would the Ukrainian economy wasn't doing too well, and this would totally help their economy out. With trade reasons, of course. So, what was the international community's response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine? Well, the United States, United Kingdom, and NATO countries, so most countries situated in Europe, well, most powerful countries, um, levied economic sanctions on Russia's economy. So they put restrictions on trade. So, example, they increased tax, they enforced fees and fines. They put restrictions on travel leaders and members of parliament around Europe. Plus, business deals were cut off and accounts were frozen, as the World Bank, the banks that these Russian members of parliament used were U.S. owned. So they did that. And now I'm going to talk about the U.S. invasion of Panama in 1889 to 1990. So first, where is Panama? Panama is right there, and the Panama Canal is going to make the route from transporting seaports from this part of the U.S. And it's gonna, instead of going all the way around South America, it's gonna cut that distance and just go through this canal. Let me zoom in. So this is the canal right there. So the canal is a 48-mile long artificial waterway that connects the Pacific Ocean and the Atlantic Ocean, well, or the Caribbean Sea. So, like I said, this would decrease the travel time and help with the trading between people on the companies on this side and this side. So, a historical timeline of the Panama Canal. In 1881, a French company began constructing the canal, but due to economical challenges, they had to stop. So in 1901, an American company took control and continued the making of the canal. And in 1904, August, the canal opened and it was under U.S. control. But in 1977, the U.S. signs a treaty to give the canal over to Panama by the year 2000. They did this as during this time, Panama wanted to gain back what they considered theirs, and it was about their rights and stuff. Okay, but when did this happen? It happened from the 20th of December. Well, I think it's more of the 17th of December 1889 to 31st of January 1990. And who is going to be involved? So it's going to be U.S. President George H.W. Bush and military dictator Manuel Noriega. So, and of course, the people of Panama and um, U.S. organizations like the CIA are going to be involved. So, what happened is that in February 1888, Noriega is indicated in the U.S. because of drug offenses, and um, this wasn't a problem though. Noriega was known to have been working in favor of U.S. interests. So, despite all of Noriega's drug trafficking and his bad image as a dictator, For example, in May 1889, when Panama had their voting, although Noriega did not win, he just continued his dictatorship and did not leave. So the U.S. didn't mind this because he was also known to be a CIA agent. So he was getting intel on Cuba for the US. So during this time, there was the Cold War, and it was basically US versus communism, and Cuba was communism. So they thought having Noriega would be an advantage. But at one point, they discovered that he was a double agent, and he was working for Cuba, getting intel on America. So then they decided to use all of his wrong actions, such as the drugs and the dictatorship, to finally attack. But more specifically, once they realized this, they increased their military presence in the Canal Zone. And on the 16th of December, 1889, Panamanian soldiers and civilians take 4 U.S. officers and they kill one. And the day after, this is December 17, 1889, President Bush orders the invasion for the 20th of December. And the invasion of Panama is known to have been the attempt to overthrow the military dictator Manuel Noriega. So, another reason, well, the clear reason why they invaded Panama is that he threatened the U.S. rights concerning the canal. And in 1977, I said they signed a treaty to give the U.S. signed a treaty to give the canal over to Panama. But one of the conditions were that the United States had the right to use military force if necessary to keep the canal open. Um, it was also signed that if the U.S. saw the government inside Panama as not working with the U.S. and and was not good enough for the people, they could intervene. So, um, because Manuel Noriega had threatened to permanently seize control of the canal after being indicated in the U.S. on drug charges, America attacked. So what they first did was that they started airstrikes, and then they brought in ground operations around the canal, and in just a few weeks, the war was over. So why would the U.S. Want the canal? So really, they wanted it for commercial and military importance. So because Manuel Noriega was pretty much anti-American, um, and he wanted to take control and pretty much kick America out. Of course, the U.S. would want to take it back, and so for commercial reasons, the U.S. this image shows the top countries crossing the canal for trade in 2013, and United States is the biggest country. And commercial reasons, so the canal's current annual revenue is $2 billion. So, explained in the lenses of analysis. So Bush would invade Panama for systemic reasons. He would want it, like I said, for commercial reasons, trade-wise, as most of the trade America was doing was oil. And Noriega's reason for being anti-American, it could have been sub-state, as like I said, he was a double agent. But for state reasons, I mean, he could have shown Panama to being an independent state and uniting what's theirs and giving them the power. But what was the international community's response to the invasion? Well, in December 22nd, 1889, Algeria, Colombia, Ethiopia, Nepal, Senegal, and Yugoslavia took it to the Security Council and declared that, quote, well, it's all quote, that it strongly deplores the intervention in Panama by the armed forces of the United States of America, which constitutes a flagrant violation of international law and of the independent sovereignty and territorial integrity of the state, and demands the immediate cessation of the intervention and the withdrawal of Panama of the armed invasion forces of the United States. So, what they wanted, all these countries wanted, was for the UN Security Council to kick the US out of Panama, as it was a violation. But the France and the United Kingdom and the US, but the France and United Kingdom vetoed this response, meaning they kind of passed it on. They regretted it, meaning the UN couldn't do anything about it. So why were the responses different from the Russian invasion and the Panama invasion? I mean the US invasion, yeah. So is that in Russia, when Russia invaded Ukraine, this was working against the interests of powerful countries. For example, if Ukraine were to join the EU, and during this time Britain and France were part of the EU, for example, this would have been working in their favor, as this is more trading partners and this is economic value for them. And that's really the main reason. And for the US, the US intervention would be working in favor of their interest of powerful countries. For this was during the Cold War, and the Panama Canal, like I said, was used for trading purposes for the US, internationally, really, but mainly for Europe. And powerful countries, once again, Britain, France, this is why they would veto the response made by all the other countries, as this was working in their favor. And I guess the leadership of both of the countries at the time took place. The leadership of Panama was a military dictatorship, and he violated the law, and although he lost, he just continued his reign. So that's another thing. And Putin, like, even his approval rate within his country were pretty low at 53%. So it would make sense why internationally as well people would have similar views. And also, I need to clarify the legality of the invasion for the US of Panama. Like I said, Panama signed the treaty stating that they were allowed to use military force if they saw that the Panamanian government was not legible or good enough for the people. So my conclusion and evaluation is that um, these countries are working at a realist point of view. They invaded for power issues, really. They wanted more power, so they took it. Of course, there's a little sense of liberalism, as gaining this power would equal like better economic trade, well, economic reasons and trade. Um, but what I see from the international organization's response is that there's no real international law. There's no one to enforce that international law, meaning it's kind of useless. I'm as the UN, international organizations are like the UN, and the UN really did nothing during the invasion of Russia. And like I said, the UN invasion couldn't do anything in the US invasion of Panama. So, although individual states had their responses, international organizations didn't really do anything. Because realist theory states that international organizations are used as tools to achieve self-interest. So, by using as their self-interest, for example, the U.S. invasion of Panama, if you consider it an invasion, the UN was against it. Well, a lot of countries were against it and brought it to the UN, but because in the UN, two other major countries vetoed their statement, this worked in the U.S. interest, as this basically allowed their invasion and made it and just allowed it to continue and actually happen. Um, yeah, and So the impact of power on international organizations. So obviously, um, powerful countries have more role within the international organization. Like I said, because there are five main countries who can veto a statement brought in by any other country, and it's the U.S., UK, France, Russia, and oh, France, U.S., UK, Russia. Um, I'm forgetting one, but these countries have the power, are known to be pretty powerful, and China are known to be pretty powerful countries. So that is why they were allowed this decision to veto responses. And powerful countries usually have good ties and allies with other powerful countries. So because Russia didn't have really any good alliances with other European countries, a lot of European nations were against their invasion of Crimea for obvious reasons now, as it didn't work in their favor or it was against their interest. So the impact of power in organizations is pretty important if you want, like I said, um, because there's no international law. A lot of these powerful countries can just could just violate supposedly international law, and a lot of weaker countries could not. As for example, the U.S., since their military is so powerful, could just do what could just put could just go against their views and possibly attack them. I'm not sure if that makes sense, but yeah. And so that is it. And that's my bibliography. Yeah.